Again, read from my book, Letter to My Anxious Christian Friends. So again, this was written in 2016, but the trend lines have, if anything, intensified. When newspapers reported in late January 2016 that NASA and NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, had declared that 2015 was the hottest year in recorded history, and by the way, that continues to be the case. What did Americans see in those headlines? NASA declares 2015 the hottest year in human history. What did they see? Did they see the authoritative warnings of trained government scientists doing the job that we are paying them to do? Did they instead see the exaggerated claims of ideologically driven liberals getting ahead of the science, fostering alarm and snagging more money for themselves? Which is it? What do we see when we see headlines, for example, about climate change and scientists worrying about it? Why do we see what we think we see? Climate, of all current issues, seems like the ultimate Rorschach test. What do you see when you look at what is being said? So very much depends on what we bring to the scene. I'm going to be more autobiographical here because this issue is personal to me because of my father. I grew up in Northern Virginia in a household in which the breadwinner for most of that time was my father, David E. Gushee, another David, who was an MIT-trained chemical engineer. During most of my growing up years, my father worked as an energy and environmental policy analyst for the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress. This relatively unknown outpost of the federal civil service is one of the hidden gems of the federal government. The Congressional Research Service is a collection of scholarly issue specialists whose job is to offer well-researched, even-handed, dispassionate briefings to members of Congress and their staffs. Any hint of bias or partisanship would destroy their credibility and probably threaten the very existence of the office. So in my formative years, what my father did was to write energy and environmental policy analysis for the Congressional Research Service of the federal government. And I'm proud of what he did. My father he died in 2020 during COVID. My father was a hard-headed scientist who undertook research and offered briefings that contributed to the first major round of environmental legislation of the 1960s and 1970s. He helped to brief the Congress people who wrote the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and others. Dad was not an environmentalist. He voted conservative. He was a pretty committed Republican, but part of his work was to pay attention to the environmentalist groups and what they were saying. That was all part of the data that he was crunching as he was speaking to Congress. But the way Dad would describe the overall picture made sense to me then, and it makes sense to me now. He said, by the 1960s, it had finally become clear that since the Industrial Revolution going back to the 1700s, human beings had developed the capacity to do substantial damage to the created order. In other words, our technological and economic power had grown sufficiently that we could damage the created environment in which we all live and on which we all depend. Dad would say that nature, which he understood to be God's creation, as I do understand, God's creation had been designed with extraordinary resilience in the face of inevitable ecological impacts. So he would say, don't panic, God's creation has resilience built in. And he would give lots of examples of that. But the resilience of creation is not infinite. No living organism has infinite resilience. The strongest, healthiest human body, for example, has considerable resilience, but the human being inhabiting that body can make decisions over and over again that ultimately threaten and finally destroy their own bodily resilience, right? If you drink to excess or smoke cigarettes or whatever, or drive at 120 miles an hour, you can threaten the resilience built into the human body. Does that make sense? What we were discovering, said Dad, in the 60s is that the collective action of human beings was locally and globally threatening the resilience of the created order. Now that is not ideological. That is not partisan. That is just an observation that makes sense unless there's some ideological or profit motive reason not to take it seriously. Dad will go on to say that one key role of the scientific community is to monitor the status of ecological resilience. What natural scientists do is they are trained to take the Earth's temperature, literally. They examine the health of the oceans and rivers, the lakes and the streams, the forests and the savannas, the beaches and the deserts. They pay attention to the living and the dying of the millions of species of plants and animals that share our planet with us. Their warnings, based on their findings that are peer-reviewed, along with the observations of amateur naturalists of all types, as well as regular people who know dirty drinking water and polluted air when they experience it, help to stir human beings all across the world to take seriously the damage that had already been done. Beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, this began to happen. And these scientists taught us to see that what we do to the creation, we do to other creatures. And what we do to other creatures, we eventually do to ourselves. We had, in many cases, a mistaken idea that we were here, the superior species, that creation was below us for us to manage or to enjoy. But what we didn't see is it's more like a nest, or more like, it's more like a river and we're the fish. We're in the ecosystem. We're not above it, we're part of it. So what we do to the creation, we do to ourselves. So gradually, scientists helped us to see the interconnectedness of life. Not because of a mysticism, but because it is what their data showed them. If you disrupt ecosystems, you affect all the species in that ecosystem as well as the people who depend on it. In the 1960s and 1970s, the US government developed a bipartisan policy response to better take care of our land, sea, air, other species, and ourselves. It was a tremendous achievement. Dad was justifiably proud of helping to equip Democrats and Republicans to write environmental legislation that actually made our air cleaner and our water safer to drink, and our land safer to farm. My father had confidence that eventually we would mobilize ourselves to take collective action again in the future if it proved to be needed. There's laughter from the peanut gallery over here. You know where I'm going, and you're getting there ahead of me, right? Beginning in the 1980s, those scientists who specialized in monitoring local, regional, and global climate began to coalesce around the conclusion that the overall temperature of the atmosphere was consistently rising. This had not happened before in the long history of temperature monitoring, which goes back centuries. Doing what scientists do, they said, well, we need to pay attention to this because this is different. And so some work to discover and to theorize about the most important causes of what they gradually came to call global warming. Others work to develop models. Models are projections of what might happen in the future if different courses of action unfold. Models of what the likely impacts would be of continued warming at various levels of speed and intensity. So some people are continuing to monitor the evidence of climates changing and ecosystems changing in response, and Others are projecting now, if we have this amount of temperature rise over this amount of time, what's likely to be the impact in the agriculture and the oceans and in the temperature and such. And others began to think about what became known as climate mitigation and climate adaptation, which is, okay, if we project this amount of climate change, how will it affect cities that are at sea level or agriculture in different areas, and how do we get people ready for that? Some were working on what policy steps would be necessary to, if possible, slow or reverse the trend of global warming. And if we couldn't slow or reverse the trend, could we adapt to it? The issue began to be viewed with sufficient seriousness that the United Nations, which, by the way, while it's fairly problematic in a lot of ways, does sponsor important global research. The United Nations established a massive research apparatus to investigate this problem, and it became known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, if you're keeping score at home. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been reporting its results every 6 or 7 years for more than 35 years. A major resource. The reports that they put out are, well, they used to be printed, but it was eating up too many trees, so you can put them online, right? But I actually read several of these massive, or parts of the massive IPCC reports when I was working on climate change, and they reflect an amazing and impressive body of scientific research. Scientists that I know personally who have been involved with the IPCC process say that the work is done at the highest level possible, that the findings are stated in rather muted rather than alarmist terms. Like they'll say, okay, we have a range of projections of what will happen. Here's the most alarming. Here's the least alarming. We'll tell you about the whole range and pitch it like right here in the middle. And one reason why there's kind of a check on the level of alarmism is because government officials ultimately approve IPCC documents. And so there would be political incentives on the part, for example, of the oil-producing countries to go for the more muted rather than the more alarmist kind of projections. My father tended to be cautious about climate science in his last years. He was concerned that some of the most vocal scientific voices on climate change were beginning, some of them, were beginning to go beyond the evidence as they had it because they were convinced of the deep seriousness of the overall trajectory. So the problem was this. If the worst estimates of the possible impact of global warming are right, then human beings have to act rather radically now to change the course of human consumption and energy use to prevent disaster later. So my father was concerned that there was an incentive for some scientists who had the most alarming projections to maybe tell the story in a way to get action faster than the data was actually warranting. On the other side, those scientists would say, if we don't move quickly, we could be in an unsustainable planetary emergency before too long. And human inertia, disbelief, and self-interest make it very difficult for people to act aggressively to address a problem that does not present itself as urgent. And that, I think, has been part of the problem on climate change. The warnings, it's like the frog in the kettle. The warnings were intensifying, and we were literally beginning to boil ourselves, but we were getting used to it. And didn't want to make the changes that the scientists were beginning to say we would need to make. In 2006, I helped to draft an evangelical declaration on climate change that became known as the Evangelical Climate Initiative. At that time, an impressive array of conservative evangelicals were willing to sign off on a statement that said 4 main things. 1, climate change is real. Shocking, but we got that. 2, the impacts of climate change look like they're going to be pretty serious, with a special seriousness for those least able to adapt, the poor and in the most vulnerable regions. 3, Christian moral convictions demand a response because we have to care about the well-being of our neighbors. That basic love your neighbor thing. And 4, the need to act now is urgent and clear enough that everyone needs to go ahead and make a move on this now. So this document came out at a time when there was pretty strong bipartisan support for climate change legislation, 2006. One thing that was pretty apparent to me was how extraneous things could distract proper attention. We released a statement summarizing our results, and we bought an ad in the New York Times. And when it turned out that the funding for that $50,000 ad had come from the Open Society Institute, that is George Soros' institute, a number of the conservative signers were pressured to remove their names from the statement because George Soros' institute had funded the ad. Think about that. Climate change, cooking the planet, but we can't sign on to this because George Soros' institute helped to fund one ad in the New York Times. I learned a lot about the politics of the evangelical world at that time. Around this time, and then after, this became a partisan issue. Sadly, Republicans, not all of them, but many of them, began rejecting all of the claims represented in our declaration. They began saying, well, maybe climate change isn't real. Well, if it's real, maybe it's not going to be that serious. Well, maybe it's actually going to have some positive results. It'll be warmer in Sweden, and heaven knows they need it, or something, you know? Or this is not a problem that we need to worry about because Jesus is going to come back soon, and something like that. By now, for many election cycles, it has tended to be the case that the Republican presidential candidates act as if climate change is a matter of complete indifference. And this is a betrayal of the bipartisan promise of environmental action that my father invested himself in 50 years ago. This is not a partisan issue. This is a planetary ecological emergency. I think there are some pretty deep theological reasons why many Christians can't take climate change seriously. This is kind of a human problem. This is so big, how do you even wrap your mind around it, right? But the theological problems include the idea that God is sovereign and nothing happens without God willing it or permitting it. The idea that human beings are too small to be given responsibility. In other words, to say that we have created a global planetary problem is to give humans too much power. Never mind the fact that it's actually real. I actually was in a debate with a guy one time who said, it says in Genesis after the flood that God will never again send another flood. Therefore, there will not be flooding that affects human population. And I was like, how do I even have this argument? There is a debate between me and this guy. Don't look it up. It's not worth it. Thank you so much. Also, it is true that some people's theology of the end times is it's all going to burn up anyway, and it's going to happen soon. If it's all going to burn up anyway and it's going to happen soon, why do we need to take long-term climate action? We just need to get everybody saved so they can go to heaven when it all burns up. This eschatology is morally destructive, and it's held by millions of our fellow Christians. A sense of mission focused exclusively on the eternal salvation of human souls is also a problem. For if the rector here should say, I'm going to talk today about climate change, if there should be people who would say, the only mission of the church is to save souls to go to heaven, then the idea would be you're wasting time. The pulpit is for that. So we have to have a broader understanding of Christian mission and of the proclamation of the church. Also, clearly, as you mentioned earlier, David, an overall distrust of modern science is growing on the conservative side. Science is being treated as one of those scientists, one of those elite sectors of society that are against Christians. And so, therefore, if they say it, we should oppose it almost as a reflex. So in my 2016 work, and it's 8 years later, I write, I grieve that so many of my Christian friends have gotten themselves into this posture of defensive anti-science dismissal in relation to what the vast majority of climate scientists are telling us about the distress of the natural world. I plead with them to ask whether they really believe that our sovereign God would not let us do this kind of damage to the earth when the evidence is in front of us that we have already done so. I plead with them to ask the next time they go to the hospital for diagnosis and treatment whether they are really as skeptical of modern natural science as they sound. I ask whether they really believe that a scientific community that 50 years ago rightly analyzed the damage that we were doing to the water we drink and the air we breathe has now lost its mind and is just making up stuff about the climate. Just as we once addressed toxic air and toxic water and toxic soil, we can address global warming and its consequences. But right now, American Christians are among the world's most recalcitrant forces in terms of engaging climate change.